This video will examine Ukraine's recent invasion of Russia, its motivations and consequences, and the implications for the war. On August 6, Ukraine launched a surprise offensive into Russia's Kursk region, with at least 1,000 troops and dozens of armored vehicles, catching Russia unprepared and breaking through two lines of Russian defenses. The offensive also included communications jamming that prevented the Russian command from effectively organizing a defense. Since then, Ukraine's forces have made steady gains. Ukraine's top commander says Ukrainian armed forces now control 1,000 square kilometers, or roughly 400 square miles of Russian territory. As of August 13, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky claims his forces control 74 settlements. The Russians, for their part, have admitted to 28 settlements being under Ukrainian control, and are acknowledging having lost land about half the size of what Ukraine has claimed. This attack clearly caught the Kremlin flat-footed, and Russia has been carrying out a chaotic evacuation of nearly 200,000 civilians over the last few days, while rushing to send forces to repel the Ukrainians. Russia had constructed fortifications along the part of the border Ukrainian forces crossed through, but they are less dense than those on the front in eastern Ukraine, and appear to have been poorly manned with inexperienced conscripts. The Ukrainian operation and its initial success seems to have caught everyone by surprise, with the US saying it wasn't given a formal heads up about it despite Western weaponry being used by Ukraine. So what prompted the offensive? President Zelensky only formally acknowledged the operation on August 10th, and flagged it as a way to bring the war home to Russia, and also destroy the source of Russian strikes on Ukrainian territory. But since then he's been relatively muted publicly in the strategic reasoning and the ultimate endgame for such a risky play. However, it's not hard to see why the Ukrainians felt they needed to shake things up. Big picture, the war is not going well. Russia currently controls roughly 18% of Ukraine's territory, and has been steadily advancing in the east, where Ukrainian defenders are under relentless pressure. Ukraine is already facing a personnel shortfall, and recruitment is lagging throughout the country. Despite new laws lowering the age of conscription from 27 to 25, and instituting harsher penalties for failing to register for the draft, the Wall Street Journal reports that draft dodging is rampant throughout Ukraine. Meanwhile, many of the soldiers currently serving have been serving since the war began. At the moment, the only available ways to leave the Ukrainian military are injury, death, or the end of the war. Additionally, with the US election nearing, funding and weapons for Ukraine's war effort might dry up. If former President Trump wins office, he's likely to push for a rapid negotiated end to the conflict, which will inevitably involve Ukraine ceding some of its territory. Even if Vice President Harris wins, there's no guarantee she'll continue the Biden administration's policy of support to Ukraine. Total American support for Ukraine's war effort already exceeds $100 billion, and there's likely going to be a breaking point from the US public for additional support. And let's not forget the ongoing war in Gaza, and the shadow war between Israel and Iran, which has consumed a lot of oxygen. Ukraine has found itself being crowded out of the priorities list in Washington by events in the Middle East, and would likely benefit by having its war take center stage again. Ukraine's goals for this operation are no doubt both strategic and psychological. We'll start with the strategic goals first. Even though Ukraine has engaged in strikes, sabotage operations, and cross-border guerrilla raids in this part of the Russia-Ukraine border since 2022, this is the first large Ukrainian ground incursion into Russian territory, and actually the first time Russia has been formally invaded since World War II, forcing Moscow to assemble significant forces to repel the offensive. The immediate result is to relieve some pressure on the Ukrainian city of Sumy, which according to Zelensky has been targeted with more than 2,000 Russian strikes launched from Kursk since June. More importantly, up until now, Russia has been able to concentrate its forces in eastern Ukraine on the assumption that its own territory would be safe from a large ground operation. By credibly putting the roughly 1,000-kilometer-long northeastern border it currently shares with Russia in play, Ukraine will force a strategic rethink in the Kremlin. Russia will have to keep sufficient reserves to defend its own borders in addition to fighting in Ukraine, spreading its forces more thinly and taking pressure off the Ukrainians in Donetsk and Luhansk provinces, and potentially also constraining future offensives in Ukrainian territory. If Ukraine can successfully occupy Russian territory, it also would have leverage to reclaim its own territories in a future exchange during peace negotiations. However, it's not yet clear if Ukraine intends to hold or can actually hold the land it has seized. Ukrainian Foreign Ministry spokesman Georgy Tiki said that Ukraine does not intend to take territory in Kursk. However, Russian military bloggers have reported seeing Ukrainian troops digging fortifications and capture territory. As Russia organizes a response, we'll see whether Ukraine decides to dig in or ultimately retreat back across its own border. On the psychological front, while the strategic value of this operation ultimately remains to be seen, there's no doubt it has been a humiliating embarrassment for the Kremlin. Despite operating in one of the most heavily monitored battlefields in history, Ukraine amassed a large force near the border, some estimates putting it at up to 12,000 troops, and crossed into Russia while the Russian high command remained oblivious. This is obviously demoralizing for both the Russian military and public, and further exposes the inability of the Russian state to fulfill the fundamental duty of any government, protecting its own population. It does remain to be seen just how much this will weaken Putin's standing with the Russian public and the Russian elite. Since the war started, the Russian state has built a very strong security apparatus to control dissent, and we haven't really seen anyone succeed in breaking through that in a meaningful way. The Ukrainian operation is even more psychologically bruising because Kursk was the site of a massive Russian victory over Nazi Germany during World War II, and has now become the scene of a humiliating Russian military and intelligence failure. Another goal of this operation is no doubt to secure a badly needed public relations win for Ukraine, demonstrating its ability to reshape the war and the fact that despite recent setbacks, Ukraine is still in the fight. This is important for the war effort because the narrative of the war dictates just how much support Ukraine receives from the West. In that respect, it has been very successful, bringing the conflict to the top of the agenda of decision makers in Brussels and Washington. So what has been the impact of this operation so far? First, it's demonstrated that despite being 2 years in the war, Russia continues to suffer from poor leadership, planning, and intelligence. Andrei Gurulyov, a member of Russia's parliament, said that intelligence had flagged Ukrainian preparations for an attack, but was ignored by higher-ups in Moscow. Ukraine has done respectable damage to Russian forces and military facilities, and has been operating largely unimpeded in Russian territory for a week, suggesting Russia's security is fairly fragile. Russia has mobilized aircraft, reserves, drones, and artillery to halt the Ukrainian advance, and after attempting to defend with territorial guards and conscripts, US officials are reporting on August 13 that Russia is moving troops from the front in eastern Ukraine, as well as from Kaliningrad, to repel this offensive. However, it's not yet clear how significant this reshuffling of forces will be, or whether it will give Ukraine's defenders in the east much breathing room. Much of what's currently happening is unfortunately clouded by the fog of war, so it's not entirely clear what the ultimate impact of this operation will be. There are limits, however, to how far Ukraine can go, given the difficulties of operating in enemy territory over increasingly longer supply chains, and the fact that most of its troops are tied down in the east. Russia is inevitably going to be able to drive the Ukrainians out eventually, whether it happens quickly or over an extended period. Given sufficient time to organize, Russia will eventually grind the Ukrainians down, and could potentially also seek to retaliate with its own counterattack into Ukraine's Sumy Oblast. The Ukrainian units and equipment used for this operation are among Ukraine's best and most experienced, and being forced to operate in enemy territory for an extended period of time, they will likely take heavy casualties. This could have a detrimental impact to the larger war effort, given the Ukrainian armed forces are currently short of fighters, and especially trained and experienced veterans. Given the scale of the embarrassment the Kremlin has endured, it's likely that Russia will seek to punish Ukraine in a significant way once the initial crisis has been addressed. Up until now, Russia has failed to meaningfully enforce its red lines despite multiple threats by both Putin and Russia's political and military leaders to deploy nuclear weapons. It is, however, possible that this direct threat to the homeland could change their calculations. Retaliation could include large-scale attacks on Ukrainian cities and population centers, another mobilization to potentially beef up its military further, moves to bring the nation closer to a full-scale declaration of war, or continued nuclear threats. Big picture, it remains unlikely this operation will substantially benefit Ukraine. In the best case scenario for Ukraine, Russia would permanently draw down some of its forces in the east and station them to defend the border. This would slow down its conquest and potentially even freeze the conflict. However, the fundamentals of the war have not really changed. It's still largely a war of attrition, and Russia has a far bigger economy, population, and military-industrial complex to draw from than Ukraine. Russia has been rearming and moving to a war economy since the conflict started, and despite heavy casualties, it currently has an army 15% larger than when the war began. Additionally, it's not dependent on outside support the way Ukraine is, and can afford to wait and continue a grinding fight against the Ukrainians. On the other hand, if Russia is able to repel the attack with heavy Ukrainian losses and continue its push in the east, Ukraine will have squandered precious forces for a temporary morale boost. To me, this operation feels reminiscent of the Tet Offensive, where the North Vietnamese gambled big on a surprise attack that would demoralize the US public and gain a psychological victory. That operation was a military defeat for North Vietnam and the Viet Cong, but it did actually lead to the US deciding the Vietnam War was no longer worth it, and ultimately withdrawing from Vietnam. Russia, for its part, seems committed to continuing the war no matter what, given the enormous political capital that both Putin and the Russian elites have expended on this war, and also the substantial economic and diplomatic costs Russia has already endured. This means that regardless of how many gains the shock and awe operation secures on the battlefield, the long-term trajectory of the war largely remains unchanged and still favors the Russian side. What do you think? Leave a comment below with your assessment of what this incursion means for Ukraine, Russia, or the war as a whole. And see you in the next video.